July 5th, 2011 will forever be remembered in the history of America's most controversial cases. A day when Casey Anthony, the mother accused of murdering her daughter, received a verdict no one could have expected: not guilty. Everyone, from legal experts to ordinary citizens, gasped, unable to believe this decision. The whole country stood silent, unable to comprehend the truth. But one thing is undeniable: Casey Anthony has become one of the most hated names in American history. Caylee Anthony, the unfortunate 2-year-old child, was brutally murdered in a cruel act by her own mother. But the strange thing is, Casey did not show any grief or remorse for her daughter's death. She continued to live a normal life, attending parties, dancing, going to bars, participating in bikini competitions while Caylee was missing. Caylee's death is one of the most horrific things that society cannot forget. And after all the undeniable evidence, Casey was still found innocent. Have you ever wondered, is justice really served? Is Casey really innocent, or just a heartless mother trying to avoid responsibility? Follow the journey in Part 4 of this case, where all the secrets of the trial will be revealed, with contradictory testimonies, lies, and the public's outrage at knowing that a mother can kill her daughter and go out and live a normal life as if nothing happened. On July 15th, 2008, Mrs. Cindy Anthony called the police and reported the disappearance of her 2-year-old granddaughter, Caylee Anthony. However, the strange thing is that Caylee's mother, Casey Anthony, did not report her daughter missing for 31 days. During that time, Casey showed no signs of worry or loss for her child. Instead, she lived a carefree life, going out, partying, and even posting pictures on social media to show off her happy life, as if nothing had happened. The police were quick to get involved when Cindy called to report the incident, but things got strange from the start. Casey claimed that Caylee was staying with a nanny named Zani the nanny, someone she described as a very close family friend. Zani was the person who had been looking after Caylee all this time. But when the police started looking into the nanny, they couldn't find any clues about Zani. There was no one named Zani, and no one in Casey's family or friends had ever heard of him. Not only did Casey give false information about Zani, she also changed her story about Caylee's whereabouts. Initially, she said Caylee was with Zani. Then she claimed Caylee was with an old friend of hers. But when police began to search for this friend, they discovered that no one in Casey's family knew this person. These changes made investigators doubt Casey's story, and they began to realize that something was wrong. Why wouldn't a mother call the police when her daughter went missing? Why didn't she show any signs of distress? On July 17th, 2008, police continued their investigation of Casey and discovered that her car, a black Pontiac Sunfire, was abandoned in a nearby parking lot. When they opened the car door, they noticed a strong odor of death. The stench from the car made investigators think the worst. Upon closer inspection, they discovered trash bags full of rotting food, and surprisingly, traces of chloroform, a substance that can anesthetize people, were found in the car. This only increased the police's suspicion that Caylee may have been drugged before being killed. But the story didn't end there. As Casey continued to answer questions from the police, she changed her story again. She claimed that Caylee had been kidnapped by someone named Zani and taken somewhere. When the police asked Casey for information about Zani, she couldn't provide any real information. There was no nanny named Zani, and everything she said was a lie. At this point, the police began to have serious doubts about the veracity of Casey's story. She kept changing her story, from Caylee being with Zani to being kidnapped. However, there was no evidence that Zani existed, and Caylee was never found. All of Casey's statements were contradictory and unprovable. Casey did not seem to be worried or remorseful about her daughter's disappearance. Instead, she continued to live her happy life without any remorse. On December 15, 2008, while Caylee was still missing, Casey was arrested on charges of perjury and child abuse. However, when the police searched for Caylee's body, they could not find her for a long time. It was not until December 11, 2008, a resident accidentally discovered Caylee's body in an area near the Anthony family home. Her body was found in a garbage bag on the side of the road, wrapped in a blanket, and her mouth and nose were sealed with duct tape. When the police took Caylee's body to the forensics department, forensic experts quickly confirmed that Caylee had been dead at least a week before her body was discovered. Although the exact cause of death could not be determined, the forensic doctors confirmed that Caylee's death was not an accident, but an intentional act. The discovery of chloroform in Casey's car and traces of duct tape around Caylee's mouth and nose only strengthened the police's suspicions. Casey Anthony was the one who killed her daughter. After Caylee's body was discovered, the case began to attract a lot of media attention. People could not stop talking about what happened. Casey Anthony became an unavoidable name on TV shows and in the media. Images of Casey having fun at parties, not worrying about her missing daughter, sparked a wave of public outrage. People began calling Caylee the monster mother and could not understand how a mother could kill her child in such a cold way. The public could not bear the truth, and everyone focused their attention on her, hoping for a trial that would bring justice to Caylee. When Casey Anthony's trial officially began, the public could not take their eyes off the developments in court. Caylee stood before the jury, cold and expressionless. The defense team tried to prove that she was just a traumatized mother, but all the evidence in court pointed to one thing: Casey Anthony was the murderer. However, the trial was not simply a legal battle over Caylee's death. It was also a justice battle in which everyone expected a clear verdict. Caylee was dead, and was justice served? On July 16, 2008, when Casey Anthony first confronted investigators, no one could have predicted that her testimony would become the pieces of the puzzle that would never be assembled. Police knew they were starting to hit a huge iceberg. Everything about Caylee Anthony, from her disappearance to Casey's ever-changing statements, was filled with contradictions. Initially, when Caylee reported Caylee missing, she described her daughter as being with a nanny named Zonnie the nanny, whom she described as a very close, trusted friend who had been taking care of Caylee all this time. Caylee insisted that she trusted Zonnie very much, and that Caylee was in the nanny's care. She said that she had not been able to see Caylee because of work, but that she would be able to see her daughter soon. However, when the police started investigating Zonnie, they could not find any trace of her. Zonnie did not exist in any records, and none of Anthony's family or Casey's friends had any information about her. This made the investigators skeptical about the authenticity of Casey's story. But the story did not end there. As the police continued to search for clues, they discovered that Caylee had changed her story several times. Initially, she said that Zonnie had taken Caylee to a nearby park. However, when the police checked the surveillance records and security cameras at the park, they could not find any images of Caylee and Zonnie. The police suspected that Zonnie was just a fictional character that Caylee had made up to cover up the truth. What made things even more confusing was the way Caylee faced the questions. Every time the police asked about Zonnie or where Caylee might be, Caylee would randomly change her story. She couldn't pinpoint Zonnie's whereabouts or provide any clear information. Caylee's statements began to become jumbled and confusing. She couldn't explain why she hadn't reported Caylee missing in the first place, and why she continued to live a normal life, going out, partying, while her daughter was missing. Not long after, Caylee told the police that Caylee had been taken care of by another friend of hers named Jeffrey. However, when the police investigated Jeffrey, they couldn't find anyone by that name in the Anthony family records. Caylee continued to say that Caylee had been kidnapped by a woman she met in the park. But when the police couldn't find anyone related to her, they became even more certain that Caylee was lying. Caylee's account of Caylee's disappearance became increasingly complex and unbelievable. Police began to suspect that she was deliberately fabricating stories to cover up the truth. At this point, Caylee was not only Caylee's mother, but also the only suspect in the case. On July 17, 2008, when police checked Caylee's Pontiac Sunfire, they detected a strong stench coming from the trunk. It was not the smell of spoiled food or old furniture, but the smell of death, the smell of a decomposing body. Police immediately confirmed that this was an unmistakable sign of Caylee's death. When they opened the trunk, they found garbage bags filled with rotting food, but what caught their attention even more were the unusual traces in the garbage bags. Upon closer inspection, they discovered that there was chloroform, a substance that can be used to render someone unconscious. Chloroform wasn't something anyone could easily find, and this made the police even more suspicious of Caylee. They began to realize that Caylee might have been unconscious before she was killed. Traces of chloroform in the car were a crucial, irrefutable clue. And when the police found a blanket in the trunk with traces of blood on it, it became clear Caylee was dead and Caylee was the culprit. On December 11th, 2008, after Caylee's body was discovered in a garbage bag on the side of the road, the public couldn't take it anymore. An innocent child had been murdered, and her mother showed no remorse. America couldn't understand how Caylee could do such a thing. Caylee wasn't just the victim of a violent death. She was also the victim of her own mother's lies and indifference. From the moment Caylee was found, a media storm began. Details about Caylee Anthony, from her failure to report to the police to the happy photos of her at parties, became hot topics on the news, and no one could ignore the case. The image of Caylee was not only that of an uncaring mother, but also that of apathy and indifference. During the investigation, questions began to pile up. How could a mother kill her own daughter? Why didn't she report to the police? Why did she live like this? Nothing happened while her daughter was missing. Caylee herself continued to maintain a cold attitude and firmly denied all accusations. She showed no remorse or concern for Caylee's death, but instead, she continued to live her life as normal, as if she had nothing to do with this incident. Investigators continued to work day and night to find the truth, but Caylee still maintained that she did not kill Caylee, and that what happened was just an accident. However, all the evidence pointed to one thing. Caylee Anthony was the culprit, and it was her constant lies that made people even more outraged. With contradictions in her testimony and undeniable evidence, the trial began to attract great attention from the media. Caylee Anthony became a symbol of cruelty, of a mother who coldly murdered her child. On December 11th, 2008, Roy Kronk, a plumber, was working along Suburban Drive in Orlando, Florida. As he walked through an area filled with reeds, he noticed a strange trash bag dangling among the grass. Sensing something was wrong, he approached and opened the bag. What he saw made him stop and catch his breath. A small body, not completely decomposed, but identifiable as that of a child. It was Caylee Anthony, a 2-year-old girl who had been missing for a month. The strong stench from the body made Roy Kronk immediately realize that this was no ordinary discovery. He called the police and reported the discovery. When investigators arrived on the scene, they quickly realized that this was Caylee Anthony, the girl the entire nation had been searching for. Caylee's death has become one of the most heartbreaking stories in the history of American crime. The public and the media have followed her disappearance closely, and now that Caylee's body has been found, the biggest question is who is responsible for this brutal death? Police quickly cordoned off the area and began an autopsy. Forensic experts began their work immediately. Caylee's body was taken to the medical examiner's office, where doctors quickly determined that she had been dead at least a week before her body was discovered. The smell of death in Caylee Anthony's Pontiac Sunfire further reinforced the suspicion that Caylee had died in Caylee's car and that her body had been cruelly hidden. As the medical examiner continued her investigation, some important details began to emerge. Caylee's mouth and nose were taped shut, a clear attempt to prevent her from calling for help. These traces could not be accidental. Caylee had clearly been killed intentionally. Not only that, forensic tests also found a quantity of chloroform in Caylee's car, a substance that can be used to render a person unconscious. This further clarified the suspicion that Caylee may have been anesthetized before her death. The next day, when this information was released to the public outrage was relentless. Photos of Caylee enjoying parties, going to bars, and participating in entertainment activities when Caylee was missing further highlighted her insensitivity. Caylee Anthony was not only a cold mother, but also an irresponsible and cruel person. Caylee was suspected from the beginning when the police discovered inconsistencies in her testimony. During the time Caylee was missing, Caylee did not report to the police, did not provide any information about her daughter's whereabouts. She continued to say that Caylee was being cared for by a nanny named Zani. However, when the police could not find any trace of this person, things began to fall apart. Zani the nanny did not exist, and Casey's story became more and more strange and unfounded. As investigators continued to interview Caylee, she began to change her story, from saying that Caylee was staying with a friend to saying that she had been kidnapped. But all of these could not be proven. On July 17th, the police began to look into Caylee's Pontiac Sunfire. During the investigation, the car became a hot spot. When investigators examined the car, they discovered blood stains and strange markings. Police detected a strong smell of death in the car, along with traces of chloroform. All of these details made the police more certain that Caylee had died in the car. Her death was not simply an accident, but a deliberate act. The police quickly examined the blanket in the trunk, which had traces of blood. When they opened the blanket, they discovered duct tape on Caylee's mouth and nose, which further strengthened the evidence that Caylee was intentionally killed. Investigators continued to search for evidence and traces to clarify the remaining questions, but it was clear that Casey Anthony was the only person who could have been the culprit. The whole country could not stop talking about this case. Caylee had become a symbol of innocence lost, and Casey Anthony was a cruel mother who killed her child without showing any remorse. Although Casey continued, on May 24, 2011, Casey Anthony's trial officially began in the Orange County Courthouse in Orlando, Florida. This trial was not only a legal battle, but also a battle between justice and indifference, a battle that the public watched every minute, every second. Photos of Caylee having fun, partying while her daughter was missing, had sparked outrage. But now, the trial began, and all the details of Caylee's death would come to light. From the very beginning of the trial, Jeff Ashton, the prosecutor of the case, did not hesitate to make a very strong strategy. He stood before the jury and began with a strong statement. It is clear. Casey Anthony killed her daughter. She killed Caylee because she did not want to be bound by the responsibilities of being a mother. She killed her innocent child because she wanted to have the free life she wanted. Ashton quickly pointed out the undeniable evidence, from the chloroform in Casey's car to the duct tape around Caylee's mouth and nose. Combined with the smell of death in the car, Ashton asserted that there could be no reasonable explanation for Casey's actions. With convincing words, he exposed Caylee not as an innocent mother, but as a heartless and cruel mother, willing to kill her daughter to live freely. Photos of Caylee at parties, dancing and laughing, without any sign of a grieving mother, only increased the hatred towards her. When Caylee was about to be tried, all eyes were on her. Caylee sat there, showing no emotion, her eyes never leaving the desk. She just sat silently, her eyes cold, without any remorse. The people in the courtroom and the entire public wanted to see some emotion, some remorse from her, but there was none. Casey Anthony remained stoic, showing no sign of being the mother who killed her child. Meanwhile, Jose Baez, Casey's defense attorney, spoke up to defend his client. He disagreed with the prosecutor's accusations, asserting that there was not enough evidence to prove Caylee was the culprit. Baez argued that Caylee may have died from an unfortunate accident in her grandparents' pool, and that Caylee hid the body because she feared the family would blame her. Caylee is not a murderer, Baez said. She is just a traumatized mother who did not know what to do when faced with the death of her daughter. Baez did not stop at denying Caylee's guilt, but also tried to create a psychological reason for her actions. He theorized that Caylee may have been sexually abused as a child, and that these traumas led to her concealment and lies. Baez appealed to the jury for sympathy, hoping they would see Caylee as a victim of circumstance rather than a murderer. Baez's arguments, however, did little to quell public anger and police suspicion. Caylee may have been abused in the past, but that did not explain why she killed Caylee and then hid her body. There was no evidence to support Baez's theory of a swimming pool accident, and the evidence in Caylee's car clearly pointed to a premeditated act. Prosecutor Ashton continued to flesh out the details. He presented evidence from Caylee's Pontiac Sunfire, where the smell of death and traces of chloroform were found. "This evidence cannot be tampered with," he said. "There's no way a swimming pool accident would have traces of chloroform in a car. And there's no way a mother would leave her child's body in a car for days without calling the police." He continued to point out the absurdities of Casey's story, that she didn't call the police about Caylee's disappearance for 31 days, and that she was focused on living her happy life while her child was missing. The courtroom fell silent when Caylee was asked to take the stand. She walked up with no emotion, no regret, no grief. The public couldn't take their eyes off her. They couldn't believe what was happening. Caylee stood before the jury, but not a word, not a tear, not a sign of remorse. She simply stood there, cold and emotionless, not a mother facing the crime she had committed. Then the witnesses continued to be called. Caylee's friends gave important testimony. They recounted that Caylee always lived a free life, without having to worry about taking care of Caylee. They said that Caylee rarely spent time with Caylee, and that she often attended parties and went to bars. These testimonies further clarified the image of an irresponsible mother, a woman who had no real interest in her children. Photos of Caylee having fun, participating in competitions, the bikini she wore, while Caylee was missing, only added to the public's disgust with her. Baez, however, refused to give up. He relentlessly criticized the prosecution's evidence and tried to prove that Caylee was just a traumatized mother. He insisted that Caylee's every action stemmed from an invisible anxiety, that Caylee could not have died in an intentional act, but in an accident that Caylee did not know what to do. The trial became increasingly tense as more and more forensic evidence was presented. Caylee Anthony remained calm, but it was clear that she could not escape the close scrutiny of the public. People became increasingly angry with her, especially when they saw that she had no remorse for Caylee's death. The court continued to allow witnesses to testify. George Anthony, Caylee's father, took the stand and insisted that he had no knowledge of Caylee's death. He claimed that he loved Caylee very much and could not imagine what would have happened if he had not found her body. But when Baez began to make allegations about George Anthony possibly abusing Caylee in the past, George reacted violently. He cried and denied all of the allegations. Finally, after weeks of arguments and debates, the trial became extremely tense. Both the prosecutor and the defense team made strong arguments, but no one could be sure of the outcome. The public could not believe what they were witnessing, but they knew one thing for sure. Caylee Anthony would not forget, and Caylee, on July 5, 2011, the entire United States and millions around the world watched every minute, every second in the courtroom. What they thought would be a fair decision in the Caylee Anthony case ended up being an unbelievable shock. When Judge Belvin Perry read the verdict, Caylee Anthony pleaded not guilty to murder, manslaughter, or child abuse. Instead, she was found not guilty of all charges related to Caylee Anthony's death. The courtroom was silent for a moment, then erupted in shock and outrage. Caylee's family, those who loved her, could not believe what they had just heard. Caylee stood silently, showing no emotion. After all the overwhelming evidence, the contradictory testimony, and the constant lies, she was found not guilty. The public could not accept this. Images of Caylee Anthony, from her happily attending parties while Caylee was missing, to photos of her in bikini competitions and dancing at raves, sparked hatred in the hearts of people. Caylee became a symbol of indifference, of a mother who killed her child and showed no remorse. After the verdict, live interviews continued. Nancy Grace, the famous host, could not contain her anger. "This is not justice," she said on her show shortly after the verdict was announced. Caylee Anthony is a murderer. She killed her daughter, and she got away with it because of lack of evidence. These statements seem to reflect the thoughts of the entire public, who could not understand why an innocent child was not protected and why a mother who killed her child could go free. Meanwhile, Caylee showed no remorse or guilt. She walked out of the courtroom without looking back, as if the verdict had changed nothing in her life. She had spent 3 years under indictment, 3 years in the shadow of public outrage, and now she walked out free, with everything behind her. George Anthony, the father whom many considered the invisible victim in this story, could not find words. He stood there in the courtroom, his eyes red, unable to believe the court's decision. Cindy Anthony, Casey's mother, could not stand either. Their whole family had been through a terrible nightmare. They had lost Caylee, and now they had lost their daughter. Casey Anthony walked out of the courtroom and started a new life. She no longer had to face the constant criticism from the public, but her life could not be the same as before. Although she was found innocent in the eyes of the law, Casey could not escape the shadow of anger and hatred in the eyes of the public. The whole of America continued to criticize, outrage, and some people even organized protests to demand justice for Caylee. But for Casey, her sentence was over. She was not legally responsible, but would have to face a life haunted by this event. A few years later, Casey appeared in television interviews and continued to insist that she did not kill Caylee. In an interview with the Today Show in 2013, she said, "I live with the shadow of this case every day. I know that I will never be able to go back to normal life." She also said that she felt hurt, but she did not apologize to Caylee's family and felt no remorse for her actions. Although Casey was found innocent, Caylee still could not forget. Her name still resonates in the hearts of the public. Those who demand justice for Caylee continue to fight. They still cannot accept that Casey Anthony was acquitted. And although Casey has lived her life freely, the angry and critical eyes of the public will never leave her. Casey's life cannot be the same again, because Caylee will always live in the hearts of those who loved her. Caylee Anthony is no more. Her death is an irreparable tragedy. Casey Anthony is a murderer in the eyes of the public, but in the eyes of the law, she is still innocent. And when this story ends, a big question remains. Was justice really served in this case? Caylee is gone. But can we trust the legal system when a mother can get away with murdering her child? This is the end of this case, at least legally. But for Casey Anthony, the story is not over yet. She will have to live with her own shadow, with the name Casey Anthony becoming a symbol of apathy and obsession that no one can forget. Casey Anthony verdict, justice or failure? True crime documentary, Part 5, will take you into the final details of the case. Will justice really be served? Let's follow the final part of this documentary series explores the never-before-revealed details and the reasons why this case remains unsolved. Don't miss Part 5 of this documentary series to learn more about the open ending of the Casey Anthony case and whether there is truly justice in such a complicated world.